Hello, Tilvani here, and today I'd like to share with you my Poison Bladefall Blade Blast Occultist League Starter for 3.19 Lake of Kalandra. This build is incredibly satisfying to map with, as you will be exploding screens with both Profane Bloom and Obliteration Wands. In addition to that, because it's a poison build, it has very strong single target as well. Bladefall Blade Blast is just a powerful choice for a league starter, as it is able to perform well on budget gear while also having massive potential for scaling all the way into the endgame. Alright, so let's get into it. Why Bladefall Blade Blast? The combination of these two skills has always been very strong, as they provide excellent clear and single target. It was actually the dominant league start for several patches, until it received consecutive nerfs in 3.14 and 3.15. However, with the introduction of physical masteries, Blade Blast has slowly been creeping back into the meta. Next up, Blade Blast is a physical-based spell. It also hits dozens of times, so it is an ideal delivery system for poisons. I actually spent several days trying to get a Poison Blade Vortex build to work instead. However, I finally gave up on that, because Blade Blast is just too strong comparatively. There are two main reasons for this. First, unlike Blade Vortex, Blade Blast is a ranged ability, so you don't need to put yourself at risk by standing in melee and sitting on a boss's face like you would with Blade Vortex. Second, try as I might, I could not solve for life sustain on Blade Vortex. It was just too costly to invest heavily into life recovery, and because poison builds deal such low hit damage, leeching life wasn't an option either. However, because Bladefall Blade Blast hits their target dozens of times per cast, we are able to utilize life gained on hit through the use of Sibyl's Paw or a Shaper's Ring. Alright, so then why Occultist? Those of you who played Bladefall Blade Blast back in its glory days will remember that it was mostly ran on Assassin. However, back then, we had very easy access to explosions with Legacy Explodey Chest, and Bladefall Blade Blast Assassin was usually transitioned to some sort of Blade Vortex build once you had saved up enough currency. In the current meta, Occultist is just a better choice for this, as it has built-in explosions and increased area of effect. So if you want to transition to a meta build later in the league, like Cast on Crit or Blade Vortex, then Occultist is going to be your best choice when compared with Assassin. Not that you have to reroll, mind you, as this build absolutely slaps with some investment. Another really great thing about Occultist is that it has built-in Wither and Chaos resistance. This makes it much more realistic to keep Wither uptimes on bosses, and allows us to achieve capped Chaos resistance fairly easily as well. Next, I'd like to go over some of the pros and cons of this build. Let's start off with the pros. This build has a lot of explosions. Because we're running Obliteration Wands and Profane Bloom, we'll be blowing up screens at a time. It is also a ranged build, so you'll be able to avoid a lot of damage that melee players wouldn't be able to. Next, because of the pathing we are doing on the passive skill tree, we are able to achieve 100% spell suppression without any suppression on gear. We are also gaining access to a lot of elemental resistances, chaos resistance, and attributes. So this build is incredibly easy and affordable to gear in a league start scenario. In addition to this, because we are using the Dendrobait unique chest, we will only need a 5-link gem setup to outperform a Tabula. Finally, the build can be scaled all the way into the endgame. So if you're tired of rerolling after a few days, and just want to play one character to invest heavily into, it's completely possible to do that with this build. Next, let's take a look at some of the cons. This build is a 2-button build, so it can feel clunky to play for some players. Adding to this, it is also a poison build, so your damage will be delayed. This isn't a problem in the very end game, once you've put some investment into the build, as one tick of poison will be enough to kill monsters while mapping. However, early on in the league, it can take several seconds for monsters to die. Next, this build is fairly reliant on both Obliteration Wands and the Dendrobait unique chest. GGG has said that they have adjusted the drop rate for unique items in 3.19, So while these items have been reasonably affordable in previous leagues, we are headed into some uncharted territory here. And we may need to pay a little more chaos for items that typically have been 1C trash in the past. Also, if this build becomes very popular, or other content creators also recommend using items in this build, the price for some of the uniques could be expensive initially. Fortunately though, there is a divination card for obliteration, so even if the item starts high initially, it will soon drop in price. Finally, the build uses Eldritch Battery to solve for mana costs. This is actually a great thing in the endgame. However, most of our energy shield is again coming from the Dendrobate unique chest. So until you manage to acquire this item, you will most likely need to use an Enduring Mana Flask or run Clarity. Alright, so taking a look at the PoB, you can see that we have over 8 million DPS with all of our buffs active. This is a little bit misleading, however, as we're only going to have focus up for around 33% of the time. So accounting for that, we'll be closer to around 6.5 million DPS. But this is also assuming that you're constantly casting Bladefall Blade Blast non-stop, which you won't realistically be able to do, as you'll have to move to avoid damage and such. Also, this number doesn't factor in the ramp time for Wither. If we set Wither stacks from 15 down to 1, you'll be able to see that initially we're dealing much less than 6 million damage per second. But even with all of that considered, it's still pretty decent damage for a budget league start build. You'll also notice that we have 100% spell suppression chance, which again, we are able to achieve exclusively through the skill tree. So you won't have to worry about buying overpriced and expensive spell suppression gear. But more on that in a little bit. For our weapons, we are using Obliteration Wands. These are getting a huge buff in 3.19, as they will now grant up to 40% physical damage gained as extra chaos damage. Obliteration are also very nice because of the explosion chance they grant. Thanks to these, your mapping experience will be buttery smooth. I kind of expect these wands to be a little bit expensive early on, but it also depends on how popular poison spell builds are this league. Again, thankfully there is a pretty common divination card for obliteration, so the price shouldn't stay too high for long. However, early on, you might want to run a Sibyl's Paw for life gain, and maybe a Beano's Kitchen Knife or a Cold Iron Point if you can get your hands on one. Next, we have our helmet. We will be using an armor evasion base crafted with loathing essences. You'll need to get maximum life on this, and an open suffix for the ailment duration craft. Thankfully, we don't need the full 9 to 10% reservation efficiency once we are running Eldritch Battery, so you could probably get away with a lower tier essence for this craft. Here we have our Dendrobate chest. Since this is a league start build, we are only running it on a 5-link. However, because the socketed gems are supported by Chance to Poison, it is functionally a pseudo 6-link. Because of this, it will vastly outperform a Tabula Rasa, as long as you are meeting the dexterity and intelligence requirements for its bonuses to poison. This should be very easy to do, as we are already getting over 200 dexterity and intelligence from the passive tree alone. Next up, we've got our gloves. We are going to be running the Embalmer early on, as these gloves are a pretty big damage increase. But they're not entirely necessary, and you can replace them with a pair of rare gloves if you can't get your hands on them. In an ideal world, you'd want to pair with Corrupted Temporal Chains or Despair as an implicit, but those probably won't be available early in the league. Moving on, we've got our boots. These are one of the most flexible pieces of gear we have. It'd be best to try to get an armor or armor evasion base with life, movement speed, and some resistances. Next, we've got our jewelry. For our amulet, we will be running the Eternal Struggle. This is an incredibly powerful item, as you can get some really wild implicits on it. However, the main reason to use this is that it gives 15% culling damage, 15% global defenses, and up to plus 50 all attributes. The attributes are actually very important to help us reach the minimum dexterity requirement for Dendrobate bonuses, as well as helping us reach 155 strength for determination. An alternative to this would be the Carnage Heart Unique, an Astramentus, or just an Onyx or Citrine Amulet with a lot of attributes on it. For our Anoint, we will be running Toxic Strike. This only costs 1 Crimson Oil and will allow us to cap poison chance more easily, as well as offering some juicy poison dot multiplier. Moving on, we've got our rings. These are probably going to be a little bit expensive at League start, but the price should drop fairly quickly over the first 48 hours of the League. For our first ring, we have a Shaper Ring, and this is pretty mandatory for life sustain, as this is the best way to get life gained on hit for spells. If you can't afford one of these, Sibyl's Paw might be an alternative option early on. However, going that route is a pretty big damage loss, as you won't be able to use Obliteration Wands. Next, we've got our Hunter Base Curse Ring. If you've somehow managed to pick up an Embalmer Glove with a curse implicit on it, you won't need this. However, getting curse on hit somewhere in the build is pretty mandatory. Otherwise, Occultist just won't feel that good for mapping, since without it, you won't be getting those juicy Profane Bloom pops, as it's not really realistic to manually cast your curses while mapping. In a pinch, it might even be worth to pick up a Mark of Submission and just socket Temporal Chains or Despair into it. Ideally, however, both of your rings should have life, resistances, and maybe just a little bit of dexterity on them. A mana cost reduction craft could also be helpful if you're struggling with mana costs before you've got your Dendrobate and Eldritch Battery set up. Finally, we've got our belt. For this, we are running a Stygian Vise. All you're looking for here is life, resistances, and maybe some strength. For the Abyss Jewel, you'll want to get life and some damage. Moving on to our flasks. We are running an instant life flask with Corrupting Blood immunity. For our utility flasks, we will be using a Jade, Granite, Silver, and Quicksilver flask. Finally, you'll want to grab some jewels with life on them, and you'll also want to look for poison damage, poison duration, dot multi, or chaos dot multi. If you can swing it, getting resistances or attributes on these in addition to life and damage would be huge. This is also a good place to pick up some increased mana regeneration rate prior to your Dendrobate setup. Next, let's take a look at our skills. For our pseudo 6-link Dendrobate, we are running Blade Blast, Increased Area of Effect, Unbound Ailments, Void Manipulation, and Deadly Ailments. Increased Area of Effect is very important as it allows us to get more overlapping Blade Blasts, and thus increases our clear potential as well as our single target damage. During the campaign and before you get Dendrobate, you will need to socket Chance to Poison into this setup. If you somehow manage to get a 6-link Dendrobate, I'd probably pick up Cruelty, Efficacy, or Vile Toxins as your 6th link. Here we have our Wither Totems. These will help us ramp Wither stacks more quickly on bosses and tanky Arch Nemesis rares. Moving on, we have Plague Bear. Plague Bear actually puts in work while mapping. You can think of it almost like a Poison Righteous Fire. It will absolutely melt everything standing inside of its AoE. So to help Plague Bear do its thing, we are picking up Increased Area of Effect. Next, we've got Flame Dash. This is your main movement skill, and unfortunately because we are dual-wielding wands, we don't have access to Whirling Blades or Shield Charge. For our auras, we will be running Determination, Malevolence, and Vitality. However, early on, you may need to forego one of these auras in order to pick up Clarity to help sustain mana costs. For the final build, Vitality is pretty nice here, as it gives us a little bit of a cushion for incoming damage. However, if you wanted a little bit more damage at the cost of survivability, you could drop it for Herald of Purity or Herald of Agony. Next, we've got our Poacher's Mark. You'll actually want to make sure this has 20% quality on it, so that you can generate frenzy charges against bosses. I know it's only a 5% chance to gain a frenzy charge on hit, but we are hitting dozens of times per cast with both Bladefall and Blade Blast, so you will generally ramp up to maximum frenzy charges very quickly. Speaking of Bladefall, we are going to keep this gem at level 1. This will help keep its mana costs low. We are also going to be keeping Spell Cascade at level 1, but this is because Spell Cascade gains increased area of effect at higher levels. For Bladefall, we'll want to keep the cast as tight as possible, so that Blade Blast is able to overlap more often and Concentrate to deal massive single target damage. Unleash will also give us more blades per cast, and faster casting is just a more damage multiplier. Moving on, we've got Molten Shell tied to a cast when damage taken setup. As usual, we are keeping this at level 10 and level 1 respectively. Our last 2 gem slots are flex spots. At the moment I'm running Stone Golem with minion life to give a little more life recovery, but I actually think Enduring Cry is a good option here as well. Just make sure you're not overloading your skill bar too much, as we are pretty tight for active skill space. In the endgame, you'll probably want to replace one of these flex spots with another aura, once you can afford Enlighten support, and have access to more reservation efficiency. Next, let's take a look at the passive skill tree. It's a little convoluted, but I'll walk you through it. I've also tried my best to throw in some leveling trees for this build, so you can click down here and get some different ideas for pathing at various stages of the campaign. However, in the interest of transparency, while I have playtested the build with the gear shown in the PoB on standard, I haven't actually leveled the build through the campaign yet. But I have leveled Poison Blade Blast Assassins many times over the years, so I am confident this is doable. Some things to note here are that we are taking this node for attributes and resistances. But if you can balance your character without this node, you should drop it. The next thing to mention is that we are pathing up here for Eldritch Battery. This in combination with our Dendrobate is going to allow us to ignore the high mana costs of Blade Blast. Moving on, because this is a League Start build, and suppression gear is very expensive early on, we are actually reaching 100% spell suppression entirely through the tree. This is achieved through the following: the Instinct nodes here, the Inveterate nodes down here, the Reflexes nodes here, and this keystone, Magebane. Honestly, pathing through the middle of the tree here is pretty decent, as we get access to more life, more resistances, more armor, and evasion as well. However, once you can afford spell suppression on gear, you can drop some of these nodes for more damage. And there you have it, my Poison Bladefall Blade Blast Occultist for 3.19 Lake of Kalandra. As usual, I'll close the video out with a quick Guardian map so that you can see the potential of the build on equivalent gear to that shown in the PoB. Keep in mind, however, that even on a 6 link, this build is dealing less damage than it will be in 3.19. as the updated Obliteration wands are close to 40% more damage than the current variant. And, if you've made it this far into the video and have found it helpful, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel, as you'd be helping me out immensely. Anyway, thank you for watching, good luck with your league, and I'll see you in the next one.